I've buried 3 people in my life and I never cried at a single funeral. Not my mother's, not my wife's, not my brother's, and he was the closest thing I had to a soul. But I cried in a kitchen in the fall of 1889, standing over a pot of scorched beans, because a woman I had hired as a housekeeper had just gotten down on the floor, all of her, and there was a lot of her, to let my 6-year-old daughter braid her hair. That's the whole thing. That's the story. Everything else is just me trying to explain it to myself. I'm going to tell you what people said about her. I'm going to tell you what I said about her, in my own head, the first day I saw her step down off the stage at Mercy Bend with her carpet bag and her broad shoulders, and her face already set against whatever I was about to think. And then I'm going to tell you what she did, and you can decide which one of us was smaller. The beans were burning, and I couldn't smell them. That was the thing about that autumn. I'd stopped smelling anything. Ellen had been in the ground 9 months and my nose had quit on me somewhere around the second. The doctor in Cheyenne said it happened sometimes. Grief doing strange work in a man's body, and that it would come back. It hadn't come back. So the beans burned and I stood there stirring them with a wooden spoon, and I didn't know until the smoke reached the window and my son started coughing. Caleb was 8. He coughed like an old man, 3 short barks and a wheeze, and then he said from the table behind me, "You did it again." I did what again? The beans. I looked down. The bottom of the pot had gone the color of a horseshoe left out in the rain. Ruthie was 5 then. She turned 6 that November, and she didn't say anything. She never said anything. That was the piece that kept me awake. She talked plenty before her mother died. Chattered, actually, the kind of chatter that made you want to put your head under a pillow, and then her mother died and the chatter stopped like somebody had turned a spigot. 9 months. 9 months of a 5-year-old girl sitting at a table with her hands folded and her eyes going wherever they went. I scraped what I could into 3 bowls. I set them down. Caleb ate his without comment, which was its own kind of comment. Ruthie moved her spoon around and didn't lift it. "Eat," I said. She didn't. "Ruthie, eat." She looked at me. She had Ellen's eyes, which was a cruelty I hadn't been prepared for, and she looked at me with them, and then she looked back down at the bowl and she didn't eat. I put my hands flat on the table. I remember that. I remember pressing my palms down against the wood, because if I didn't press them against something, I was going to do something with them, and I didn't know what, and I was 34 years old and terrified of my own hands in front of my own children. That was the night I wrote to the agency in Denver. I should tell you about the ranch, because you'll want to know what kind of man was making these decisions, and the truth is the ranch will tell you faster than I will. 600 acres in the lap of the Chiricahua foothills, though we called it the Broken Ladle, after a creek that bent like a spoon somebody sat on. Cattle, mostly. A few horses I couldn't bring myself to sell. 2 hands, Enrique and a kid named Booth who was more trouble than help but who worked cheap and had nowhere else. A house Ellen had picked the curtains for. Curtains I hadn't touched. I was not a cruel man. I want to say that, and I want you to hear how weak it sounds even to me. I was not a cruel man. I was a man who had gone quiet in a way that had teeth. There's a difference between a man who hits his children and a man who doesn't speak to them for 11 days, and I want to tell you that difference is enormous, but I've had 30 years to think it over, and I'm not sure anymore. The letter I sent to Denver said, "Widower, 2 children, require a woman for housekeeping and the raising of same, wages fair, location remote, applicant should be practical." Practical, that was the word I used. I'd read it back 4 times, and every time it seemed like enough. She came on the 14th of September. The stage into Mercy Bend came in at noon if it came at all, and I was leaning against the post outside Dollins with my hat pulled down, and I watched the coach roll in with its dust cloud folding over it like a wave, and I watched the door open, and I watched a woman come down the step. She had to turn sideways to do it. That was my first thought. Not hello, not this is the woman who is going to be in my house. My first thought was that she had to turn her shoulders to come through the coach door, and my second thought was a word I'm not going to write down, and my third thought was a hot flush of shame at the second thought, and that shame turned immediately, the way it does in a man who won't sit with it, into irritation. At her, for making me feel it. She was tall, broad in the shoulder and broad in the hip and broad in the arm, built like something you'd put a barn roof on, and her hair was the brown of a wet fence rail and pinned up in a way that had already started coming loose. She wore a gray traveling dress that had been let out at the seams and let out again, and you could see where. She wasn't trying to hide it. She set her carpetbag down. She straightened up. And she looked at me, right at me, across 40 feet of Mercy Ben's only street, and I watched something happen in her face. It was very small. Her chin came up maybe half an inch, and her mouth flattened, and her eyes went somewhere behind themselves the way a door closes without slamming. She'd seen me look. She'd seen the whole thing, the turn sideways and the word and the shame and the irritation. She'd read it off me in about a second and a half, and she had put her face away somewhere safe before I even started walking over. She'd done that before. That was the part I understood later and didn't understand then. She had done that a great many times. "Mr. Hollies," she said when I got close. "Miss Vance." "Just Vance is fine, or Marguerite." A pause. "Most don't manage Marguerite." "Marguerite," I said, and I heard how stiff it came out. She said. I bent for her bag and she got there first, and picked it up like it was full of feathers, and I remember my hand closing on air and feeling absurd. Then she said, "Where's the wagon?" And I said, "This way." And that was the entire conversation between the woman who saved my children and myself for the first 11 miles. Here's my quirk, and you'll find out anyway, so I'll say it plain. I keep a book. Not a diary. I want to be clear about that because diary sounds like a word for a lady's Christmas gift, and this was a black ledger I bought in Tucson for 4 bits, and it was mine. Every night, whatever kind of night, I wrote 3 lines. Weather, cattle, one other thing. The one other thing was the whole reason for the book, and it started because Ellen used to ask me at supper what the best part of my day had been, and after she died there was nobody to ask, so I asked myself, and I wrote it down. Sometimes the answer was nothing. I wrote nothing 41 times in the first winter. I counted later. That's what I did with an evening. The night Marguerite Vance arrived, I wrote. Sept 14. Clear, wind out of the west after 4. 2 heifers moved down to the lower pasture, 1 lame will look tomorrow. The new woman is here. She is very large. I do not know if this was a mistake. I want that on the record. I want you to have read it in my own hand, because it's going to matter later what kind of man wrote that sentence and whether he was allowed to stop being him. She met the children at 4:30. Caleb was in the yard, throwing a knife at a fence post, which he was not supposed to do, and which I had stopped telling him not to do somewhere around June, because everything I told him not to do he did harder, and I had run out of the thing inside a man that lets him keep saying it. Ruthie was on the porch step, just sitting, hands folded. I helped Marguerite down from the wagon. She let me that time, and her hand in mine was hot and rough and steady. And she stood in the yard, and she looked at my son throwing a knife at a fence post, and my daughter sitting like a small gray stone, and she did not say anything about either of them. What she said was, "That your kitchen garden?" I looked where she was looking, a rectangle of dirt west of the house. Ellen's, grown over now with cheatgrass and 1 stubborn sunflower that had come up crooked and refused to die. "It was," I said. She said again. Then Caleb turned around. He was 8. He had his mother's mouth and my temper, God help him, and he looked at Marguerite Vance standing in his yard in her gray dress with her carpetbag at her feet, and he said, loud, deliberate, straight across the yard so that every ear on that ranch heard it. "She's fat." The wind was moving in the cottonwoods. That's what I remember, the dry sound of it like paper being crumpled slow. I had my hand halfway to my belt before I knew I'd moved. Not to use it. I want to be honest, I don't think I would have used it, but my hand went there, and Marguerite saw my hand go there, and she stepped in front of me. Not fast. She didn't lunge. She just took one step and put herself between me and my son, and her back was enormous and gray, and it filled up the whole world. "Don't," she said. "He can't." "He can." Her voice was low and it did not shake. "He can, and he did, and it's true, and you hitting him won't make it less true. It'll just make it something he has to be angry about instead of something he has to be sorry about." Then she turned around to Caleb, and she got down. She lowered herself onto one knee in that yard, in the dirt, in a dress she'd have to wash by hand, and it wasn't graceful. I want to be honest about that too. It took her a moment. She put a hand on the ground to steady herself and her breath came short, and I could see it cost her. She got down there anyway, so her eyes were under his. "You're right," she said, "I am." Caleb's face did something I hadn't seen it do since March. It came apart, just a little, around the edges. "So now you've said it," she went on, "and it's out and we don't have to spend the next 6 months with you working out how to say it. That's the worst part usually, the working out how." She reached over and picked up the knife where he'd dropped it, and she looked at the blade and she turned it and handed it back to him handle first. "Now, that fence post you've been murdering, is it winning?" Caleb stared at her. "Because from here," she said, "it looks like it's winning." And my son who hadn't laughed since his mother stopped breathing, who had gone hard as a green apple, who I had privately, silently in the black book I would not show anyone, begun to think of as lost. My son made a sound. It wasn't a laugh. It was a kind of sharp exhale through his nose, and he was furious about it. You could see him being furious about it, but it had gotten out of him before he could stop it, and once a thing's out you can't get it back in. She stood up. It took her a while. Nobody helped her. And Ruthie, on the step, had lifted her head. That night she cooked. I want to describe the meal and I find I can't exactly, because I still couldn't smell anything and half of eating is smelling, but I can tell you what it looked like. There were biscuits and they were the right color. There was pork and it was not gray. There was some green thing she'd found God knows where. I think she'd walked the creek before supper without telling anybody, and I found out later that's exactly what she'd done. She'd walked a strange creek on a strange ranch in a strange country an hour after arriving because she wanted to see what grew there. And there was a fourth plate. She'd set the table for 4. I sat down and I looked at that fourth plate, and something in my chest turned over so hard I had to put my hand on the table. Because it wasn't for Ellen. It wasn't a memorial, it wasn't sentiment, she'd never met Ellen. It was for her. She had set a place for herself at my table. Not a stool by the stove, not a plate in the kitchen after we'd finished, the way housekeepers ate in every house I'd ever been in. She'd put herself at the table, like she belonged there, like it hadn't occurred to her that she might not. And I opened my mouth to say something about it. I want you to understand that I opened my mouth. I was going to say, I don't know what, something small, something about how things were done, something that would have put her in the kitchen for the next 4 years and made me a smaller man than I already was, and she saw me open my mouth and she looked at me. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with a serving spoon in her hand, and her chin came up that same half-inch it had in Mercy Bend. "Go on," the look said. "Say it, I've heard it, I'll survive it, but you'll have said it in front of your children." I closed my mouth. She served the pork. Here is what I put in the book that night, and it is the shortest entry of the entire year. Sept 14 later. I was going to say something and I didn't. It took her 6 days to get Ruthie to speak. I didn't know she was working on it. That was the strange part. I never once saw her try. I never saw her crouch down and coax and cajole the way the schoolmistress had done in July, the way Mrs. Enright from town had done in April with her voice pitched high and sweet as a bird's, and Ruthie sitting there like a stone in a shawl. Marguerite just talked. Not to Ruthie, around her. She'd be kneading dough and she'd say to the dough, "Now this is the part where you have to be mean to it. People think you have to be gentle with bread. You do not. Bread is like a mule. It respects a firm hand and it will take advantage of a soft one." And Ruthie would be sitting on the flour barrel and Marguerite would not look at her and she'd keep kneading and she'd say, "The trouble is knowing when to quit, because you can be too mean to it. Then it goes tough and sullen, and it won't rise for you no matter what you promise it." And she'd go on like that, for an hour, talking to bread, talking to the fire, talking to a chicken she was plucking, and Ruthie sitting there listening to a woman have a conversation with a chicken. On the 6th day I came in for water at the middle of the afternoon, and I heard from the kitchen a voice I had not heard in 9 months. Small, rusty, barely a voice at all. "Doesn't like it." I stopped in the doorway with my hand on the frame. Marguerite was at the counter with her back to me. Ruthie was on the flour barrel, and Marguerite said, absolutely calm, not turning around, not making a single thing of it, "Who doesn't?" The bread. A pause, my daughter's voice working itself out of a place it had been buried. "You're being mean to it." "I told you I was being mean to it." "But it doesn't like it." "Well," Marguerite set the dough down. She wiped her hands. She still hadn't turned around, and I understood, standing in that doorway, 34 years old with my hat in my hand, I understood that she wasn't turning around on purpose, that she knew exactly how fragile the thing in that room was, that if she turned around and looked at Ruthie with a face full of triumph, the spigot would shut again and it might not open twice. "Well," she said to the dough, "then maybe you'd better take over." And she stepped aside. And my daughter got down off the flour barrel and put her hands in the dough. I went back out. I didn't get the water. I stood in the yard for a while and I looked at the crooked sunflower in Ellen's ruined garden, and I had a feeling in my chest I couldn't name and didn't want to. And behind me, through the window, I could hear a 5-year-old girl explaining to a grown woman that you had to be nice to it. That was the whole thing. You had to be nice to it. And Marguerite Vance saying, mild as milk, "Well, show me." Now, I've made her sound like a saint, and she was not a saint, and I'd be doing her a disservice. I'd be doing that particular kind of disservice people do, where they polish a woman until she's got no edges and then wonder why she doesn't feel real, if I didn't tell you what happened in October. Booth said something. He was 19. He was the kind of 19 that hasn't got anything yet and knows it, and so goes looking for someone with less. He'd been building to it for a month. Little things. He'd hold a door and make a show of standing well back from it. He'd offer to carry things she was already carrying. He'd say ma'am with about a 1/4 inch too much air in it. And on a Tuesday in October in the yard, with Enrique there and me there and Caleb there, when she came out to hang wash, Booth said something. I'm not going to write it. I've thought about whether to write it and I'm not going to, and if that's cowardice then it's cowardice. But the thing he said was about her body and it was about a horse and it was clever. That's what made it filth. He'd worked on it. He'd sat with it. He'd polished it up and waited for an audience. Enrique laughed. 1 syllable. He was sorry about it immediately. I could see him be sorry, but it got out. And I did nothing. I stood in my own yard, and I heard a man in my employ say that thing to a woman in my employ, in front of my son, and I did nothing. I want to tell you I was thinking. I want to tell you I was choosing my words, weighing the situation, being practical, that word again, that word I'd put in the letter, and I have hated it ever since. The truth is I froze. The truth is a piece of me. A small, filthy piece I would have denied under oath, thought. It's not untrue. The truth is I was a man who had thought a version of that word on a street in Mercy Bend and had never made it right, and so I had no ground to stand on, and I knew it, and I stood there. Marguerite set the basket down. She turned around, slow, and she looked at Booth for a long time, long enough that his grin got uncertain around the edges, and then got frightened, and then got desperate, because there's nothing worse for a boy like that than being looked at. And then she looked at me. And that look, God, that look. It wasn't hurt. I could have borne hurt. It was recognition. It was the look of a woman who had walked into 100 yards and had this happen in 100 yards and had learned, in every single one of them, exactly which men would speak and which men would stand there. And she had already known which one I was. She'd known since the 14th of September on a street in Mercy Bend, when my face did what it did. She had known, and she had come to work in my house anyway, and taught my son to laugh and my daughter to talk, and set a place for herself at my table. And now she was looking at me, and I could see her not being surprised. She picked the basket back up. "Wet wash gets heavy," she said to nobody, and she walked past all of us to the line. Caleb was staring at me. That's the thing I have never gotten out from under. Not Booth. Not Marguerite. My son, 8 years old, standing by the barn door with his mouth open, staring at his father, and I watched something in his face reorganize itself around what he had just learned about me. That night, I opened the ledger. Oct. 22, cold first frost on the trough, cattle fine. And then I sat there. And the third line, the one other thing, the best part of the day, the question my wife used to ask me across a supper table in a voice I could no longer hear in my head. I sat there for an hour with the pen in my hand. And what I finally wrote, at 11 at night, in a cold room, in handwriting I barely recognized as mine, was, "I am not a cruel man. I keep saying that. I have been saying it since Ellen died. Tonight I want to know who I am saying it to. I fired Booth in the morning. I want credit for it, and I don't deserve credit for it. And I knew that even then, standing in the gray cold outside the bunkhouse, watching a 19-year-old boy load a saddle onto a horse and try not to cry. Because I didn't do it for her. That's the thing. I did it because my son had looked at me. I did it to fix my face in my son's eyes, not hers. And when it was done, I walked up to the house feeling clean, feeling like a man who had done something, and I came into the kitchen where she was making coffee and I said, "Booth's gone." She didn't turn around. "I know," she said. "I watched him go. I wanted you to know Mr. Hollies." She turned around then. She had a cup in each hand and she set one down on the table in front of me and the other she kept, and she wrapped both her big hands around it and looked at me over the rim. "You didn't do it for me," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. "You did it for the boy," she said, "which is fine, that's not nothing. A man who does the right thing for the second best reason is still ahead of a man who doesn't do it at all." She drank some coffee. "But don't come in here wanting me to be grateful. I've been grateful my whole life. I'm tired." I stood there. "Sit down," she said. "The coffee's getting cold." I sat down. And she sat down across from me, at my table, in my kitchen, in the place she had set for herself the first night without asking anyone's permission. And outside the window the frost was going off the trough in a thin white steam, and she drank her coffee and I drank mine, and neither of us said one word for 11 minutes. It was the closest I had come to another human being in 9 months. And I didn't know that yet. That's what kills me. I sat there thinking about cattle prices and about how I'd need a new hand before spring, and I did not know, I had no idea, that my whole life had already turned over in that kitchen. That it had turned over in a yard in September when a woman got down on one knee in the dirt in front of a boy who'd insulted her, because she decided he was worth more than her pride. And that the only person at that table who didn't understand what was happening was me. The frost went off the trough. She got up to start the bread, part two. The winter came in like something that had been waiting. November went hard and dry, and then the first week of December it snowed for 4 days without stopping, and the broken ladle disappeared under it. The fences, the creek, the crooked sunflower in Ellen's garden, all of it gone white and soft and false. Enrique and I lost 6 head that week. Found 4 of them in a drawer where they'd bunched up and gone down together, and I stood over them with a shovel in my hand and I thought, they died warm anyway. And then I thought, that's a strange comfort for a man to take, and I put it in the book that night and didn't examine it further. I want to tell this part carefully. I've told it wrong before. I told it wrong to my brother, who's dead now, and I told it wrong to a priest in Bisbee in 1903 who I don't think was listening, and both times I made it sound like the story of a man slowly coming to his senses. It wasn't. It was the story of a man being dragged. The first thing that happened was the shoes. Ruthie's feet had grown. That's all. That's the whole thing. A 5-year-old's feet grow, and it was December, and she'd been jamming them into last winter's boots for a month without saying a word, because she was Ellen's daughter and Ellen never asked for anything either, and the 2 of them would have gone to their graves with their toes bent double rather than trouble a man about it. Marguerite noticed on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I was mending tack in the kitchen where it was warm, and I looked up and Marguerite had Ruthie's foot in her hand, on her lap, and she was pressing her thumb along the side of the boot leather. "How long?" she said. Ruthie shrugged. "Ruth Ann." "Since the leaves," Ruthie said, very small. Marguerite set the foot down. She didn't say anything. She got up and she went to the window and she stood there with her back to the room for what felt like a long time, and I watched her shoulders and I thought, and I am ashamed of this. I want it written down that I am ashamed of it. I thought, don't make this a thing. That was my instinct. My daughter's feet had been curling up inside her boots for 2 months, and my first instinct was to hope nobody would make a scene about it. Marguerite turned around. "There's money for shoes," she said. It wasn't a question. "There's money for shoes." "Then why," she said, "does she not have shoes?" And I said, "God help me," I said. She didn't say anything. The silence in that kitchen. I have been in rooms with dead men in them that were less quiet. "She's 5, Marguerite said. 6, nearly. She's 5, Mr. Hollies, and she stopped talking for 9 months because her mother died. And you're telling me the reason she has no shoes is that she failed to bring it to your attention." I stood up. I had a bridle in my hand. I remember the weight of it. "You've been in my house 4 months, I said. "That's right. And you think you know." "I know her feet are bent," Marguerite said. "That's all I know. I don't need 4 months for that. I need 4 seconds and a pair of eyes, and so did you." I threw the bridle. Not at her. I want to be clear about that because it matters, and it also doesn't matter as much as I used to think it did. I threw it at the wall. It hit the doorframe and knocked a peg loose and fell in a heap of leather and buckles on the floor, and the sound was enormous in that little room, and Ruthie made a noise like a kicked cat and went off the chair and under the table. And I stood there. And Marguerite Vance did not move. She did not flinch. She stood there by the window with her arms at her sides and she watched me, and there was no fear in her face at all. That was the terrible part. She wasn't afraid of me, and I understood in the space of 1 heartbeat that this was because I was not the first man to throw something in a room she was standing in, and I was not the largest, and I was not the worst. She had a whole life before me. I'd never once thought about it. "Well," she said quietly, "now she's under the table." I went outside. I stood in the snow with no coat on for 11 minutes, and I did not think one single coherent thought. When I came back in, the kitchen was empty. I could hear them upstairs, 2 voices low, and I stood in that kitchen and picked up the bridle off the floor, and I put the peg back in the wall, and I hung the bridle on the peg. And then I sat down at the table with my hands flat on it, and I waited. She came down after an hour. She poured 2 cups of coffee without asking me, and set one in front of me, and sat down across from me in her place, the place she'd taken the first night, and she blew on hers and drank some and looked at the window. "She's asleep," she said. "Marguerite, I want to tell you something and I want you to let me finish it, because I've been carrying it 4 months and it's heavy and I'm tired." I shut my mouth. She turned the cup around on the table, once, twice. "I had a husband," she said. I hadn't known that. It landed on me like a hand. 2 years. His name was Ivor Vance, and he was a small man, physically I mean. He came up to about here. She touched her own collarbone, and it made him wild. Not at first. At first he liked it. He used to say I was the only thing in the territory built to last. She drank. And then he didn't like it. It changed. I never worked out what changed. I've had 11 years to work it out, and I never have. Outside, snow slid off the roof in a long, soft rush. "He used to say things," she said. "That was all in the beginning. He was a clever man, Ivor. He could find the one word. And I'd stand there in my own kitchen and take it because I thought, and this is the part I want you to hear, Mr. Hollis, so listen." She looked up. "I thought that I owed it. I thought that a woman shaped like me, who'd been chosen by anybody at all, had a debt, and that the payment on that debt was that she didn't get to mind things." I couldn't look at her. I looked at my coffee. "He died in '78. Horse went over on him in a wash. And I want to tell you I grieved him. And I did. I grieved him for about 6 weeks. And then one morning I was making bread, and I realized I'd been holding my shoulders up around my ears for 2 years, and I'd stopped. And I sat down on the floor of that kitchen, and I laughed until I was sick." She said it perfectly flat. No self-pity in it anywhere. That was what made it unbearable. "Now," she set the cup down, "when you threw that bridle, I want you to know exactly what happened in my body. My hands went cold, my jaw locked up, and a voice in the back of my head that I have not heard in 11 years and thought I had killed said, 'What did you do wrong?'" The clock in the front room ticked. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said. "I know that. I've known that for 11 years. I know it the way I know my own name, and it took me about 4 seconds standing in your kitchen to lose hold of it entirely." She stood up. She took her cup to the basin. "So I'm going to be plain with you," she said, with her back to me. "You're not a cruel man. You're right. You say it to yourself every night. I've seen you writing in that book. Don't think I haven't. You're not a cruel man." She turned on the tap. Water ran. "You're a frightened one. And a frightened man and a cruel man do the exact same thing to a child under a table." I did not write in the book that night. That's the only entry missing from the whole year. December the 12th. There's the 11th and there's the 13th, and between them there's nothing. Just the faint ghost where the pen went down and came back up. And I have never been able to look at that gap without my throat closing. We went to Mercy Bend on Saturday for the shoes. All 4 of us. It was 11 miles in a wagon in the snow, and it took most of the morning, and nobody said much. And Caleb sat in the back with his boots hanging off the tail and threw snowballs at fence posts and hit about 1 in 5. Ruthie sat between Marguerite and me on the bench. Her feet didn't reach the boards. Halfway there she leaned over. She didn't lean on Marguerite, exactly. She leaned toward her, the way a plant does, and Marguerite lifted her arm and put it around her without any ceremony at all. And Ruthie went into her side like she'd been fitted for it. And neither of them looked at me, and I drove the horses. And I thought, my wife should be sitting there. And I thought, my wife is not sitting there. And I thought, and this is the thought I have never told anyone, not the priest, not my brother, and I am telling it now because I promised myself when I started this that I would not come out of it looking any better than I was. I thought, I don't want her to be sitting there. I wanted Marguerite Vance sitting there. And the shame of that came up through me so fast and so hot that I had to put both hands on the reins and stare at the road. Because I was 34 years old and I had been a widower for a year. And I was falling in love with a woman I had been ashamed to be seen next to on a street. And the worst thing about it, the very worst thing, was that I did not know if it was love or if it was simply that she made my house work. I did not trust myself. That's the truth of it. I looked inside myself for a clean feeling and I couldn't find one, and so I did nothing at all. Dollins had shoes. Dollens also had Alice in Wright, and half the town, and a stove they all stood around on a Saturday in December because there was nowhere else to be. We came in with the bell going and the cold coming off us, and I felt the room turn. You know how a room turns. It doesn't stop. Nobody stops talking, nobody stares, that's not how it's done. Not in a town, that would be rude, the conversation just develops a little hitch in it, a half beat, and every eye in the place takes one quick fast bite and goes back to what it was doing. Marguerite went straight to the shoe shelves with Ruthie by the hand. I stayed by the door. I want you to notice that. I stayed by the door and I took my hat off and I made a great business of knocking the snow off it, and I was 8 feet from my own household and I stayed there. Alice in Wright came over. She was 60 and kind in the way that costs nothing, which is a kind of kindness that will take your skin off if you're not careful, and she put her hand on my arm and she said, low, confidential, warm as bathwater. Well, she's a capable woman, isn't she? She is. And so good with the children, I hear, everyone says. A little pause, weighted like a stone in a sock. It's a mercy, Thomas, truly. For a man in your position, you can't be, well, you can't be particular, can you? She smiled at me. She meant it kindly. That's what I have never gotten past. Alice in Wright meant it kindly. She was giving me an out. She was standing there in a general store handing me a permission slip. Nobody blames you, Thomas. Nobody thinks you'd have chosen her. We all understand it's the children. And all I had to do was take it. All I had to do was nod. One nod. A small, rueful smile of a man who has made a practical arrangement, and I would have been safe. And every person in Mercy Bend would have gone on liking me. And Marguerite Vance, 11 feet away with her back to us, fitting a shoe onto my daughter's foot, would never have heard a word of it. I opened my mouth. Across the store, Marguerite went still. She didn't turn. She had Ruthie's heel in her palm and she went absolutely, completely still, the way a deer does, and I understood with a horror that I can still taste that she had heard. Every word. That her hearing had been trained for this since she was 9 years old, that she could pick that particular register of kind voice out of a crowded room the way a mother picks her child's cry out of a schoolyard, and that she was standing there with her back to me waiting. She'd been waiting 4 months. She had been waiting, quietly, patiently in my house, feeding my children, for the day I would be handed exactly this and would take it. Alice in Wright's hand was on my arm. And I said, "No." Alice blinked. "I'm sorry." "No, ma'am, you've got it wrong." My voice came out strange, too loud for the room. I heard it be too loud and I couldn't stop it. It isn't a mercy and it isn't a position and I'm not being. I stopped. I had no words. I had never in my life had any words. That was the whole trouble with me. Ellen used to say I could put a fence around a thing, but I couldn't ever say what was inside it. The store was quiet now, actually quiet, the stove ticking. She set a place for herself at my table, I said. Nobody understood that. I could see nobody understood it. Alice in Wright's face was a polite blank, and behind her a man I'd known 20 years was looking at his boots, and the words hung there in the middle of a general store, meaning absolutely nothing to anyone in the world. Except to one person. Marguerite let go of Ruthie's foot. She stood up slowly, the way she did, one hand going to the shelf for balance, and she turned around, and she looked at me across the whole length of Wildland store, and her chin did not come up half an inch, and her face did not go away behind itself, and her eyes filled. That was the only time. In 4 years I saw that woman's eyes fill exactly once, and it was in a general store in Mercy Bend in December of 1889 over a sentence that made no sense to anybody but the two of us, and she blinked it back so fast that I don't believe another living soul saw it happen. Then she said, perfectly level, "Ruthie needs the brown ones, the black are too narrow." And she turned back to the shelf. We drove home in the dark. Caleb fell asleep in the wagon bed with his new hat over his face. Ruthie slept against Marguerite's arm. The snow had stopped, and the sky had gone that hard black it goes when the cold means business, and the horse's breath went up in front of us like something coming apart. We didn't speak for 8 miles. Then Marguerite said to the road, "You could have taken it. I know. Everyone would have let you. I know." She was quiet for a while. Then, "Why didn't you?" And I said, "Because it was dark, and because the children were asleep, and because a man will say a thing in the dark he'd sooner die than say at noon. Because I've been not cruel my whole life, and it hasn't been enough for anybody." The wagon went on, runners hissing. She said. And after another mile, she moved her hand. She was holding the edge of the seat between us. She always did, a big flat hand on the board, bracing herself, and she moved it maybe 2 inches. That's all. 2 inches, so that the side of her hand was against the side of mine. She didn't take my hand, I didn't take hers. We drove 11 miles home like that, our hands touching along one edge, and neither of us said a single word about it. And I have been given a great many things in my life, but I have never been given anything like that. Spring was the worst of it. That's the part people never believe, and I've stopped trying to explain it. They want the winter to be the hard part because winter is the obvious part. And then spring comes and the snow goes and the fences come back and the crooked sunflower puts up a green shoot out of Ellen's dead garden. And everyone assumes that's when it got better. It got worse. It got worse because it got good, and I hadn't been good in a long time, and I didn't know how to hold it. Ruthie talked now. Constantly. She'd found the spigot and torn the handle off it, and she talked from waking to sleeping. She talked to the chickens. She talked to the dough. She narrated her own life in a running commentary, and it drove Caleb to distraction, and I loved every syllable of it with a violence that frightened me. Caleb had stopped throwing the knife. He'd started following Marguerite. Not close, he was 8, and 8 is too old to admit to following anybody, but you'd see him arranging himself into whatever room she was in, doing his chores near her. She'd taken to sending him out for things she didn't need because she'd worked out that he needed to be sent, and he'd come back with an armful of kindling nobody had asked for and set it down and stand there, and she'd say, "Well, that'll do," and he'd go off looking like a man who'd been knighted. And I would stand in the yard and watch my housework, and my chest would ache, and I'd go in and pick up a bridle and go out and mend it. Because here's what I couldn't do. I couldn't say it. I'd get as far as the kitchen door. I got as far as the kitchen door, I want to say, 11 or 12 times in that spring, and every single time the same thing happened. I would look at her, standing at the counter with flour to her elbows, being the axle my whole life turned on, and I would think, she's here because I pay her. And then I'd think about her standing in that yard in October, while Booth said what he said, and I stood there. And I'd think, if you ask her, she can't say no. That's what stopped me. That's the whole of it. Not her size, not the town, not Alice and Wright, those had all been the pretend obstacles, the ones I could have gotten over in a week if I'd had the sand. The real one was this. She was a woman with nowhere to go, in my house, on my money, 11 miles from the nearest town, and I was the man who signed her wages. And if I walked into that kitchen and said what I wanted to say, then whatever she answered, I would never in my life know if it was true. I would have made her not free, and then I would have had her, and it wouldn't have been her. So I said nothing. For 8 months I said nothing, and I let her think what she must have thought, and every night I wrote 3 lines in a black ledger, and the 3rd line got shorter and shorter until in July it was 1 word. Nothing. 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 41 times that first winter after Ellen, I counted. I did it 38 more times that summer, and this time there was a woman sleeping under my roof who would have made it something, and I did it anyway. The letter came in September. A year near enough to the day. Enrique brought the post up from Mercy Bend on a Tuesday, and there was a bill from the feed store and a paper from Tucson, and one envelope addressed in a small tight hand to Mrs. M. Vance, C.O.T. Hollies, Broken Ladle Ranch. I gave it to her at the table. She looked at the front of it for a long moment. Something moved across her face and went away. "That's my sister's hand," she said. She took it into the front room. She shut the door. Caleb looked at me. Ruthie looked at me. I looked at the door. She was in there 20 minutes. When she came out, she had it folded in her hand, and her face was absolutely composed. And she went to the stove and moved the coffee pot 2 inches to the left, which she had never once done in a year, because the coffee pot did not need to be 2 inches to the left. "Marguerite, my sister's husband died," she said, "in June. There are 4 children and a store in Prescott, and she can't run it." The kitchen was very warm. The window was open. Somewhere out in the yard, a chicken was making an unreasonable amount of noise. "She's asking me to come," she said. I did not say anything. I want you to know that I understood in that moment with perfect clarity exactly what was being handed to me. I have never in my life been handed anything so plainly. It was as though God himself had leaned down over the broken ladle and said, "Now, Thomas. Now. Say it now, you coward. You have one chance, and it is now." And I looked at her. And she looked back at me. And she was giving me room. I could see her doing it. She was standing at my stove with her sister's letter in her fist, and she had made her face gentle and open, and she was waiting. She was waiting. She had been waiting since a wagon seat in December when she moved her hand 2 inches. And I said, "When would you need to leave?" Something went out of her. I saw it go. It went out of her face and down through her shoulders and out of her hands, and she turned back to the stove and put the coffee pot 2 inches to the right, back where it had been, back where it belonged. "There's a stage on the 28th, she said. "That's 16 days. That's 16 days. "All right," I said. And I went out to the barn, and I put my forehead against the wall of the stall, and I stood there for a long time in the dark with the smell of horse and hay all around me. And I realized, standing there, that I could smell it. That I had been able to smell things for months. That my nose had come back somewhere in that house, quietly, without telling me, the way everything else had, and I had not once noticed, and I had never once said thank you. Part 3. 16 days. I want to tell you what a coward does with 16 days, because I don't think it's ever been properly written down. He does not fight. He does not beg. He does not go to her on the first night and take her hands and say the thing. What he does, what I did, is he becomes very, very busy. I moved cattle that didn't need moving. I rode fence line that Enrique had ridden 2 weeks prior, and I rode it again, slow, checking every staple, and when I'd finished I rode it back the other way. I went to Mercy Bend twice on errands that could have waited until October. I got up before her and I came in after the children were down, and I ate cold suppers standing at the counter with my hat still on, and every night I opened the black ledger and wrote, "Weather cattle." And then nothing. Nothing, nothing, nothing. 10 days of nothing, in a house with 16 days left in it. The children knew by the 4th day. She told them herself, plain, sitting on the porch step with one on either side of her, and I'd watched it through the window like a man watching a fire he'd started from across a street. Ruthie cried, loud and fully, the way a 6-year-old cries, with her whole body, and Marguerite led her, and held her, and did not once say hush or there now or any of the useless sounds people make at grief. And when it had run its course, she wiped Ruthie's face with her thumb and said something I couldn't hear, and Ruthie laughed, wetly, still hiccuping. Caleb didn't cry. Caleb got up and walked away. He walked all the way across the yard and out past the corral, and he kept going, and he was gone until dark, and when he came back, his knuckles were split open, and there was a fence post out by the north gate that had been beaten half out of the ground with a rock. He didn't say a word to me. He didn't say a word to her. He was 9 now. 9 years old, and he had learned exactly one thing about how a man deals with something leaving him, and he had learned it from me. And I stood in the doorway watching him wash blood off his hands in the basin, and I thought, I have taught him this. I have taught him this, and I have taught him nothing else. On the 12th day, she came out to the barn. I was oiling a saddle I had already oiled. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded and the last of the light behind her, and she was very large in that doorway, and I did not look up. "You're avoiding me," she said. "There's work." "Thomas." She had never once called me that, not in a year and 11 days. My hand stopped on the leather. "Say it," she said. "Whatever it is, I'll take it. I've taken worse from better men and worse men both. But do not let me get on that stage having never heard it, because I will spend the rest of my life going over this barn in my head." The saddle was in my lap. The rag was in my hand. And here is what I said. I have carried it for 30 years, and it does not improve with age. I said, "It's a good opportunity. Your sister needs you." She stood there for a moment. Then she said quietly, "You are a coward, Thomas Hollis," and she walked back to the house. The night before she left, I sat down at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock with the ledger open and a lamp turned low, and I did not write about the weather. I wrote for 4 hours. I have that page still. It's the only page in that book that isn't 3 lines. It's 11 pages, front and back, and the handwriting goes to pieces about halfway through, and I am not going to reproduce it here because a great deal of it is not fit for anybody's eyes, and some of it isn't even English. It's just a man with a pen going at a piece of paper, the way my son went at that fence post. But there's a place near the end where I wrote. I have been telling myself I say nothing because to speak would be to trap her, that she cannot refuse a man who pays her wages, that my silence is the honorable thing and the hard thing, and that I am, in fact, being good. I have been telling myself this for 8 months. I want to write down the true reason, once in my own hand, in a book nobody will read. The true reason is that if I ask her and she says no, I will have to know that a woman I was ashamed to stand next to on a street looked at me clear-eyed and found me wanting. And I would rather she leave. I would rather she leave and I keep the not knowing, than she stay and I lose it. That is not honor. That is not care. That is a man protecting himself with his children's mother as the shield. And then, at the very bottom, in handwriting I can barely read. She leaves at noon. The morning of the 28th was clear and cold and perfect, which was an obscenity. She had one carpet bag, the same one. She had come with one bag and she was leaving with one bag, and in between she had rebuilt a family from the studs, and she was taking none of it with her. And I loaded that bag into the wagon and it weighed nothing, and I stood there with my hand on the wagon rail. Ruthie would not come out of the house. She'd wedged herself under the kitchen table, in the exact spot she'd gone to the night I threw the bridle, and she would not come out, and she was not crying. She was doing something far worse. She was silent. She had gone silent again. 9 months of nothing and a year of talking, and now, on a Saturday morning in September, my daughter had gone back under the table and stopped speaking. Marguerite went in. She got down on the kitchen floor, and it took her a while. It always took her a while. She had to put one hand flat and lower herself, and her breath went short. And she got all the way down onto her belly on the boards, this enormous woman, prone on a kitchen floor in her traveling dress, so that her face was level with a 6-year-old's under a table. I stood in the doorway. "Ruthie." "Nothing." "Ruth Ann Hollis." "Nothing." "All right," Marguerite said. "Then I'll talk and you listen, and that's a fair arrangement. We've had it before." She folded her arms under her chin. "When I came here," she said, "you didn't talk, And I want you to know that I never once thought there was anything wrong with you. Not for 1 minute. I thought, that girl has got something she is carrying and she has not put it down yet. That's all. And you put it down when you were good and ready and not 1 second before, and that was your right. Silence under the table. Now I'm going, she said, and you've picked it back up. A long pause. I'm not going to ask you to put it down for me. That wouldn't be fair, and it wouldn't be honest, and you and I have never been dishonest with each other, not once. Her voice was completely steady. But I'm going to tell you a thing that took me 41 years to learn, and I want you to have it early, because I'd have given anything to have it early. The clock ticked in the front room. It doesn't get lighter, Marguerite said. The thing you carry, everybody tells you it does. It doesn't. A pause. You get stronger. That's all that happens. It weighs exactly what it always weighed, and one day you notice you're carrying it up a hill and talking at the same time. And out from under that table came my daughter's voice, small and ruined. Don't go. And Marguerite Vance, flat on her stomach on my kitchen floor, said, I have to, sweetheart. And that was all. She didn't explain it. She didn't soften it. She didn't say, but I'll write, or but you'll come and visit, or any of the lies people hand to children. And Ruthie came out from under the table and put her arms around as much of her neck as she could reach, and Marguerite lay there and let her. And I stood in the doorway with my hat in my hands, and I was 35 years old and I could not move. Caleb wasn't at the wagon. We looked. He'd gone out at first light, and he wasn't in the barn or the corral or the north pasture, and it got to be 10:30 and then 11, and Marguerite stood by the wagon in her gray dress with her hands folded, and she looked at the tree line and she didn't say anything. He'll come, I said. No, she said, he won't. Marguerite. He's 9 and he's watched his mother go into the ground, and now he's watching this, and he has decided that if he doesn't come to the wagon, then the wagon isn't real. She adjusted her cuff. I'd have done the same at 9. I'd probably do the same now. She climbed up. She did it herself, hauling on the rail, and the wagon leaned and came back, and she settled on the bench and put her bag at her feet and looked straight ahead down the road. I got Ruthie up and she sat between us, and she didn't lean toward Marguerite this time. She sat straight up with her hands in her lap, like a small gray stone. And I picked up the reins. We were half a mile out when I saw him. Up on the ridge, where the pinon comes down to meet the pasture, a boy on a fence, sitting on the top rail with his arms wrapped around his knees, absolutely motionless, watching a wagon go. Marguerite saw him at the same moment. I felt her go still beside me. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She didn't do a single one of the things a person does, and I understood exactly why, because if she waved and he didn't wave back, it would break her. And if she waved and he did wave back, it would break him, and she'd rather carry it herself. She just looked at him. And then, without taking her eyes off that ridge, she said, Stop the wagon. I pulled up. The horses blew. Somewhere a killdeer was going on about something. The road ran on ahead of us, pale and straight, 11 miles to Mercy Bend and a stage at noon. Marguerite Vance sat there looking at my son on a fence rail. And she said, still not looking at me, Ask me. My hands were on the reins. Ask me, she said. You've got about 4 minutes. And Thomas, if you don't, I want you to understand what happens. I get on that stage and I go and keep my sister's store, and I do it well because I do everything well. And that boy, she nodded at the ridge, grows up knowing that a woman who loved him got on a stage and nobody stopped her. And he'll learn from that. He'll learn it deep. And in 20 years, he'll be sitting at some table with some woman, and he'll want to say a thing and he won't say it. And he won't know why. The killdeer went on and on. I am not going to make it easy, she said. I want it said, out loud in the daylight, sober, with the child sitting between us. Because I have spent 41 years being convenient, and if I'm to be loved, I'll be loved out loud or not at all. And I sat there. I sat there with the reins in my hands and 8 months of silence in my chest, and every reason I had built, every good, clean, honorable reason. She can't refuse a man who pays her. It would be a trap. It wouldn't be free. And I looked at that woman who had just told me exactly what she wanted in plain words on a public road, and I understood that every one of those reasons had been mine, and none of them had ever been hers. She'd never needed protecting from me. She'd needed asking. And I said, "I don't want you to go. That's not it." "I know it's not it." My voice cracked. It cracked straight down the middle like a green branch, and I didn't care. "I'm getting to it. Let me get to it." She waited. "I stood in a street in Mercy Bend on the 14th of September, I said, "and I saw you come down off that stage, and I thought a word about you. I've never said it, and I'm not going to say it now, but you saw me think it." "I did." "I've been paying for that word for a year," I said, "and I've been paying wrong. I've been paying by being not cruel, by not saying anything. And it turns out a man can be not cruel from a great distance, and it doesn't cost him one damned thing." Ruthie was sitting between us, absolutely rigid, staring at the horse's ears. "You set a place for yourself at my table," I said, "and I opened my mouth to move you to the kitchen. And I have thought about that every night since. Because you knew. You knew what I was, and you came anyway, and you fixed my children, and you have never once made me pay for it, and I have been so." I stopped. I had to stop. "I have been so afraid of you," I said. Marguerite turned her head. "I don't want a housekeeper," I said. "I haven't wanted a housekeeper since about November. I want you at that table for the rest of my life, and I want it to be your table, and I have not said it for 8 months because I was frightened that you'd say no and I would have to know it." The wind moved in the grass. "So there," I said. "That's it. That's the whole of it, and it's ugly and it's late and I've got no right to it. Marguerite Vance, I am asking you to stay." She didn't answer. She looked at me for a long, long moment, and her face did the thing it had done in Dahl's store, and this time she didn't blink it back. And then she said, "Say the word." I stared at her. "The word you thought on the street," she said. "You've carried it a year. I've had it thrown at me since I was 9, and I have never once heard it said by a man who was sorry." Her chin came up half an inch. "Say it, and then say the rest, and then we'll be even, and I'll answer you." And this is the part I cut. This is where I've stopped, every time I've tried to tell it. I've told 3 people, and I've stopped in the same place every time, and I'm going to stop here too, and you can think whatever you like about that. I'll tell you what I remember instead. I remember Ruthie's hand coming over and closing around 2 of my fingers. I remember the killdeer. And I remember that when it was done, all of it, the word and the rest of it, and the long silence after, Marguerite Vance sat looking down the road toward Mercy Bend for what felt like 100 years. And then she reached over, and she took the reins out of my hands. And she turned the wagon around. Caleb was still on the fence. He watched us come. He didn't move. He sat up on that rail with his arms around his knees, and he watched that wagon come back up the road, and I have never in my life seen a face do what my son's face did. It fought. It fought so hard. He was 9, and he had decided that morning that he was going to be a man who did not need anything, and it came apart on him in about 4 seconds, and he was still trying to hold it when he came off that fence. He came off it hard. He hit the ground running. And Marguerite got down out of that wagon, slow, hauling on the rail, one hand flat, the way she always did, and nobody helped her. Nobody ever helped her, and she never once asked. And she got both feet on the road, and she opened her arms. And my son ran into her, and she took the whole weight of him without moving an inch. We were married in November in the front room, by a man from Bisbee who did not know us and did not ask. Alice and Wright did not come. A great many people did not come. I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I could carry it, that it weighed exactly what it weighed, and I was stronger than I'd been, and I could get it up the hill and talk at the same time. She planted Ellen's garden that spring. She asked me first. She came and stood in the doorway with her hands full of seed packets and said, "Is it all right?" And I said yes, and she said, "I'm not replacing anything." And I said, "I know," and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. The crooked sunflower came up again in June. It came up crooked. It came up crooked every year for 11 years, right at the corner of the plot, refusing to be anything else, and she left it exactly where it was. Ruthie married a man in Prescott in 1906. He is kind and he is loud and he holds doors and he has never once made a show of it, and I believe she chose him for that, and I have never asked. And Caleb. Caleb is 49 years old now, and he has a daughter of his own. And last spring I sat on his porch in Tucson and watched him get down on his knees in the dirt of his own yard, all the way down, both knees, to be under the eyes of a child who was angry with him. I don't think he knows where he learned it. I have never told him. Marguerite died in the winter of 1911. 22 years, 22 years at that table. I have the black ledger in front of me. I kept it up. Weather, cattle, one other thing, every night for the rest of my life, and the third line was almost never nothing again. I turned back to September of '89 last week. I hadn't looked at it in years. Sept 14. Clear, wind out of the west after 4. 2 heifers moved down to the lower pasture. 1 lame will look tomorrow. The new woman is here. She is very large. I do not know if this was a mistake. I sat with that a long while. And then I got up and I got the pen, and under it, in the handwriting of an old man, which is not the handwriting of the man who wrote the first part, and I like that. I like that you can see the two of them on the same page. I wrote 1 line. And I'm not going to tell you what it was. Some things a man gets to keep.